Carlsbad 911, what is your emergency?
Yes, my girlfriend left last night. We were at the Stevens Bar and staying in the hotel there, and she hasn't made it back to the hotel. I don't know where she went. She was talking about leaving with some other guy, and she hasn't made it back.
What is your name?
It's Robert Early. I've been pacing since 5:30 this morning.
Okay.
Just because she was pretty intoxicated.
Okay.
She has some insecurities. And
Okay, what is her name?
Emily Lambert.
How long y'all lived together?
I met her in November, and we've pretty much been inseparable since. I mean, I moved in, like, really, I guess officially December.
Just kind of walk through what y'all done and when she came.
We met up with my boss and the other employee at the hotel bar and just got pretty much obliterated from there. I had like a 90, almost $100 tab.
So the guys that actually work on the oiled rigs, they're called roughnecks, and they're called roughnecks for a reason. This is a job where masculinity is key. You have to be strong and you have to be tough. This kind of job is very, very dangerous. So everything is about the bravado and the machoism of working a job like that.
She was getting hit on by guys every time some guy grabbed her. Her dress was see-through completely. You know, she had a smaller size cut bra because she's a C. She was wearing a B she brought from Walmart. She was looking really good. She said, this guy over here, one of this guys over here said, if you don't take good care of me, he'll take me home. Like, all just smart, And I said, well, if that's what you want, after all the things we've been through, you want to go home, you want to leave with some stranger, go ahead. Nobody said we have to be together. Nobody said you have to be with me. She was probably looking for, oh, baby, no, like gravel and kiss her like I normally do because of her temper and the way she is. And she was like, oh, and I'm leaving. I was like, whatever, I figured she's not stupid enough to leave with somebody. She'll just go smoke some pot. She'll either be in her car and I'll leave here in a little bit. She'll be calmed down by then and we won't have an altercation. And I sat there and I started thinking, what happens if she packs her car up and goes ahead and leaves drunk? And so that's when I left.
It's a missing persons case at this point, yet he's describing her in a way that he's almost blaming her for the circumstances. She dressed provocatively. She had a smart aleck attitude. She had a bad temper. He's got a lot of negative things to say about her, but you don't hear any concern about where is she okay? It's just a lot more like potential victim blaming is what we're hearing here.
So the mirror's busted off her car. What happened to
The door handle, I pulled the door handle off at the rig.
how'd you do that?
It'd been loose, and I thought I unlocked it, and I didn't. I went to go yank on it, and it came right off in my hand.
I was watching the video. How much time you think lapses between the time she walks out the door and you walked out the door?
I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 minutes.
Man, it's less than 3 minutes.
She could have gotten in the truck right away. In the parking lot, I already had somebody waiting for her.
What kind of past you got, Rob?
DWIs and death when I was younger.
How's your temper? Fights?
I'm never in any fights.
You're gonna tell me that you don't have a violent temper.
I don't have
You're gonna tell me that I have talked to some people in Dallas that say you do have a violent past.
Who?
I'm not gonna tell you that, okay?
I'm not, I'm not gonna just sit there and, but I've never been arrested for beating up somebody.
The first big signal is the fact that he said, I've never been arrested for beating somebody up. If somebody asked me, I would say, I've never done it. So the fact that he's already saying I was never arrested shows he knows he can get away with this. He's done it before and there was no consequences.
The problem I have, we talked to several people at the bar, and none of them see her leave with anybody. They see y'all have an argument, and now you're telling me she's missing. You know what that looks like? I mean, honestly.
I know. I mean, but I love my girlfriend. There's no way I would ever do anything to harm her. I filed a missing persons report, and what's scaring me is I'm wondering why I'm being grilled so hard. Is everything okay?
No, I've got some conflicts. I'm not gonna lie to you.
What?
I've got some problems with what you have to say.
What conflicts do we have?
One thing that people with psychopathy hate is being questioned. It undercuts their authority. And so he's actually thinking, why should I have to answer to you? This is my situation. I'm in control. That's why he's getting so irritated throughout this conversation. He doesn't run. He stays. He thinks, I'm in control of the situation. And that really shows his narcissism.
When I ask a question, and if you are deceptive on that question, your involuntary nervous system will respond. I'll absolutely be able to see it with components that are attached to your body, okay? Emily Lambert is your girlfriend, the one that you were with Saturday night, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know where Emily Lambert is located?
No.
Retest that we took, which we're here today for, which is the location of Emily, and you didn't pass.
How?
There's an easy explanation to this, which means there's some information that you need to come forth with.
I don't have any other information. Same thing I said. Everything's right on until I see her sitting in her car and another dude pull up. I get pissed. I was like, you gonna leave with him? So I busted off the mirror. And then I kicked the side of her door and yanked the handle off. And dude pulls up. Emily jumps out and gets in his ride. Was like a big cowboy white guy, cowboy hat.
What we're seeing emerge is the start of pathological lying. I mean, he's changing his story. He knows he's at risk of getting caught. And you see him rapidly coming up with these quite manipulative, deceptive stories.
And I pull up, we start, beefing, and he comes running at me with a pipe. She jumps in front. Blah!
Where'd he hit her?
Right in the head. And I was like, good. And he comes at me. I just got in the car and just burned out, I figured, what am I gonna do now? I should have called the police right away.
He shows enthusiasm as he's telling the story of his girlfriend's head getting beaten in, and he's excited about it. It makes him, the technical term would be aroused. He's clearly showing signs that this is something he's interested in. And that tends to happen in psychopathy.
And I left her there, and that's it's been eating at me because I didn't know what to say. I'm on bond probation. I was drunk. I figured she wound up in the hospital the next couple days or something.
Can you show us where that location is?
Yeah.
Horrific news out of Carlsbad tonight. Police say they found the body of missing third-grade teacher and mother of two, Emily Lambert, beaten and barely clothed behind this bar near Loving. Her boyfriend, Robert Early, initially told police that Lambert took off with another man. However, authorities now say Early has confessed to her murder.
She wanted to drink and drive all the way back to Fort Worth. I said, no, you're not leaving. Very stubborn. She started fighting with me over it. So you're not leaving. You know, sleep in that bed, I'll sleep in this bed. And she started going crazy with me, and we started, pushing around, and that's when she grabbed my arm and bit the hell out of me. And then swept me back, and I put my head against the wall. And that's when I got up and hit her.
For psychopaths, when they have a grandiose sense of self, it can often take particular forms. For Early, it's related to his masculinity and being the most macho guy in the room. He has unconsciously already revealed the reality of what has happened. There was something that she did not like. And because she didn't like it, she decided that she was going to use her own agency and stop that thing from happening. But because that threatened his masculinity, he's going to be violent.
Where did you kick her the first time?
I think in the mouth.
Okay.
Pretty much all headshots. And when I started freaking out, I'm like, oh, she was just laying there like breathing down like a weird breath. And I was, I don't know.
Like she was knocked out?
Yeah, and I didn't know what to do. And so I was like, oh my God. And I just put her in the car and drove out there. And, she was talking. I pulled into that place. I had already ripped off her mirror, her handle. She didn't want to get out. And I kicked the side of her car. We scuttled again behind that guy's house. She came to, and then as she was coming at me, I grabbed that freaking air pump. I grabbed that and whacked her with it.
Did you grab her and drag her back, or did you wrap her with something and drag her back?
I wrapped her.
What did you wrap her with?
Rope.
What did you tie? Did you tie it around her neck?
Yeah, like a slip. And then just threw it around the passenger door and shut the door. I almost freaked out. I was back like this. Probably when you back there for a whole 15, 20 minutes. Bam, bam, bam. And then out of there.
Definition of first-degree murder is that you had an opportunity to cool off and still engage in the behavior anyway. And if his plausible story of it was self-defense, we got into a fight, was true, none of these things would have happened. Emily wouldn't have been on the ground when he's kicking her in the head if he was engaging in self-defense. But he continues on with this. It's just getting worse and more brutal and grotesque and sadistic, and he's just enjoying the torture of her.
And then I got back to the hotel room, took a shower. I was able to lay down and pass out. Well, I woke up in the morning and I had seen the road. The mirror was on the ground outside, the handle was in the room, and I was panicked, freaked out, and then cleaned up and then went straight to go see her.
So after committing this heinous crime, Early goes back to the hotel room and is able to fall asleep. Somebody who had remorse for their actions, or even just the physiological reaction we would expect someone to have after so violently hurting another human being, doesn't seem to be in place for Early. He's able to just drive back to the hotel and go to bed.
Let me ask you a few questions, man. As far as the handle and that mirror, where are those at?
Oh, dude, I put the mirror in my car and I threw it in front of that Dollar Tree. I dropped it in front of it.
The handle?
No, the handle, It was either in the hotel trash. It might be where her dress was.
Where's her dress at?
Oh, I got to show you.
You don't know where. What about the rope, man? Where's the rope at?
You want to go for a ride? I just feel like everybody thinks I'm such a horrible person. I actually had no control over what I was doing.
You said you kicked her?
I kicked her with the steel toe. I kind of muscled her, hit her good. She fell back, and then I just kicked her once. Right there, squared. Ow. I kicked her a couple more times, I think. I was pissed. I mean, I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? I love this woman. And then I'm in panic mode. I really hope they do that in Crime of Passion.
For a psychopath, they know the words that people expect them to say, but they just don't have the same definition. I think what he actually means when he says that he loves her was that Emily was willing to be the toy that I wanted her to be. And like any other little kid, when they're tired of the toy and they want to throw a temper tantrum, they're gonna kick that toy. Psychopaths need other people in order for them to get their own wants and desires fulfilled, but they're only ever a tool. An object can be discarded once the object has threatened the person's own ego.
You know what I was gonna ask you though, like, I know you said you tied the rope, you said you tied the rope around her neck, right? Why did you drag her from there to the back?
Because she was right behind the house. And at that point in time, I was like, oh God, and it's right here, and this dude's gonna walk right out.
Looking for a white piece of rope. Yeah. Shouldn't be very far off the road, you just pulled over.
And it couldn't have gone any further than like throwing it, because it's not that heavy. Stop right there. Might be it. Maybe I'll get Crime of Passion or something. Yeah. It'd be pretty hard to ever get a girlfriend again.
Yeah, I think so, man. I think you'll be dating for a while, bro.
I think that he finally becomes aware that the investigators are going to charge him with murder. But he's thinking, how can I still control this situation? And I think he's trying to, even now, while he's essentially confessing to the murder, saying, well, if I can get the charges that I want, then I still won.
Well, did you hear the news?
Yes, I sure did.
And I'm being charged.
Yep.
But we also...
Telling the truth now?
Well, we were really, really drunk, and Emily was trying to leave, and I tried to keep her from not going, and she bit me and threw me into the wall, and I hit her. Things got really bad, and I was blacked out. I mean, I didn't really remember most of it until everything bad happened, and then it just went really south. I really didn't know what else to do.
What do you mean you didn't know what else to do besides kill her?
It was our...
Wasn't your wife pregnant?
Yeah.
Whose child was that? Was it your child?
Yes. I mean, she sat there for 4 or 5 days, 6 days. So it's no deal. You know, you killed your son. I know.
I'm shaken. Like, this is my dad who does everything in his power to take care of us.
Joanne Bernard and her family are searching for her father, 68-year-old Roosevelt Bernard, who went missing shortly before 2 p.m. yesterday afternoon. She claims her pregnant sister, 22-year-old Martine, is also missing. Now, police say the prime suspect in both disappearances is Cassandritz Blanc, Martine's husband.
Your wife come in?
I actually really tried to talk her to coming here. She fought me about that.
She didn't want to come?
No, sir. I told her, I mean, your father is missing. It's really serious because it's your dad and no one knows where he is. She has an issue with her mom and her dad. I feel as though they don't have a good relationship amongst each other. I was on my phone listening to music the entire time. I had the headphones to the side like this. I hear knocking. A strange man knocked on the door and, spoke to him, and all of a sudden he's gone. Mr. Bernard was gone.
Did Dad say if he knew?
No, sir.
Right off the bat, one of the first things he tells us is that he's setting up the stage for his two victims having some animosity between them, that his wife and her father were somehow at odds. So he's laying the groundwork for the rest of the story that he's about to narrate. He thinks he's really smart, and he thinks he's got it all figured out and all under control.
I forgot to mention, this is actually really important. There was a white van. I would say 2-3 minutes. I checked up to see if everything is okay, and they were not there anymore.
You know that nowadays there's video like everywhere. The video that we've seen, we never saw a white van. Okay. But we did see other things.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And one of those other things is your car. After you just told us, I think 3 times, that you left and never came back until called by the police, we see your car.
My vehicle was never at the house.
At all?
At all.
All right. Unfortunately, I was notified that we did find Dad. Okay. Dad's deceased.
What?
So we have to speak with Martine tonight.
Yeah.
Because she's family. She's not answering anybody's phone calls, or she's blocked about the whole family. We have to talk to her tonight.
I'll let her know.
Upon being told that they found the body of his father-in-law, the lack of reaction, the lack of surprise, he maintains this posture, leaning back like not a care in the world, hearing what should be devastating news, and it's not devastating to him at all.
A woman's body found in Fort Lauderdale has been identified as Martine Bernard. She was pregnant and had been reported missing. Her husband is in police custody. He's also a suspect in the death of her father.
Your wife is missing currently, or hasn't been seen for a day or two?
My wife is missing. Well, here's what's going on.
Are you two having marriage problems, or?
Not at all. So basically, I woke up and I saw a woman at my door.
When was this?
Tonight, actually. There was a woman at my door, and I was startled. Who are you?
and she explained to me that I'm Martine's friend. I've never met her before, never seen her in a day of my life. Told me, why don't you check the text message that she sent you? And I opened the text and I read it. And it's basically Martine just saying she's had enough. She basically was like, you know, I did it, you know. And
did what?
Like, she was responsible for her dad's death. In the text message, she said that she wanted to kill herself.
The incredible part at this point is seeing how confident he is in this lie and these incredulous stories that he's telling. And he's like, I'm gonna get away with it.
All of a sudden, he's changing his story. I was trying to protect her, but she supposedly killed her dad. He's now placing blame on his wife, which is typical of psychopaths. They fail to take responsibility for anything in their life.
Another thing she gave me, like threw at me, was the gun. And I'm looking at it like, holy like, I've never touched a gun before. I've never had a gun. I've never purchased one, never had one.
Okay. What was your understanding was that that gun killed both her father and her?
Yes.
You're at the police department. They got you sitting here handcuffed to a table, and you haven't even asked me why. When you went back to your apartment and you parked the car down at the end, they waited and they watched. They saw you come out. You go down and get the dumpster. They've already pulled her out of the dumpster. They're doing search warrants to go into the house. Now, obviously, she's been dead more than 5 or 6 hours. What happened?
I just need some time, like cookies. So hungry.
He's so focused on having these cookies. We know from neuroimaging and clinical research in psychopathy is that some psychopaths can become so myopically focused on what's right in front of them. They sort of have this deficit in their information processing system because they're so overwhelmed with all the information that they need to now process to make up a lie or continue on their path of deception.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, with people, not saying that it applies to me, but with people
hypothetically,
people that are in situations where they've murdered or whatnot, is there a possibility that they can get out? What are those circumstances?
An innocent person would never ask, while their wife and father-in-law were just found dead, hypothetically, if there are any circumstances where someone could get off on a murder charge. There are psychopaths that could be lawyers or politicians or salespeople. They can fake it well enough that they can relatively make it in the world. He is not a good psychopath. He thinks he's got control of the situation. He thinks his lies are believable. He doesn't even understand that his psychopathic tendencies are just shining straight through at this point.
I can tell you how. You're ready to let it go. Just let it go. What happened? Cassandra, what happened? How come? Where did it happen?
My life is done. I'm gonna get raped in prison.
His concerns are all about himself, about, poor me, what's gonna happen to me now? I mean, this shows you how callous he is and how egotistical and self-centered. It's all about him. It has nothing to do with guilt, remorse.
What started an argument?
It hurt me a lot, because Her sister's best friend. He would always say things to her. I felt like he always tried to mess up what we had together. I felt like that's all he wanted to do, was to just mess up our marriage. Anytime we had an argument, she would go to him and open up to him. And I told her that's really disrespectful.
He's shifting this narrative now to paint himself in sort of like a victim light. His wife did something to him and, that caused, him to harm her. He's trying to act like someone that's sad, that's crying. I don't even think there's any tears coming down his face, but he's trying to project what he thinks is an image of someone that's sad and upset.
I told her, you're hurting me, and she rolled her eyes. I don't care, she said. And I asked her 3 times to make sure. I went to bed, in pain, and woke up in the middle of the night, and I looked at her sleeping. Got the gun. I shot her while she was sleeping.
What part of the body?
The head.
How many times?
Just once. I felt so bad. I didn't mean to do that. But I knew I did. And I knew if anyone found out, that's it. I'm done.
A single bullet to the brain is a very deliberate act. It's not reflective of intense emotions. It's not disorganized. It's execution style. So his statement that he didn't mean it or he didn't intend to do this is really not born out of his actual actions. At that moment, when she rolls her eyes, he sees himself in the mirror for who he is, as this unimportant, unlovable, irrelevant individual, and that's something he cannot tolerate. Deep down inside, he does not have a whole lot of respect for women, doesn't like when women around him don't do what he wants them to do, and ultimately that he's able to objectify them and get rid of them. They're as disposable as a piece of Kleenex.
You killed her last Monday night, Tuesday morning. Where do you leave your wife's body? Just right there for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
It was smelling really bad. Decomposing.
You know you killed your son.
I know.
I think when detectives confront him or tell him, you killed your son, right? He, matter of fact, says yes, like he knew, but he didn't care. And I think that's because other humans, are only there to serve their needs. To Blanc, it's just another object.
His complete callousness around the fact that not only did he kill his wife, but he killed his unborn child is remarkable. And my first thought is that he was getting rid of the competition. He knew that within months, his wife would give birth, and suddenly her focus would completely change. The attention would no longer be on him, and it would be all about his son and not about him.
I tried so hard to get her up. I couldn't. She was heavy. She's, pregnant. I felt bad, but I was so scared of the consequences as well. I tried to see if I can cut her head, cut her hand. I took the dumpster. I saw it, and then that's when the idea came. I can just bring it upstairs. It has a wheel.
it's big enough. I can just lay it down, put her in.
Even the way he kind of play acts, how he had to lay the garbage container down and slide the body in, is also just bone chilling in terms of how cold it is. I mean, we cannot put ourselves in his shoes. That's an impossible thing for any of us to empathize with, because it's beyond our capacity to do so.
So, is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you want to get off now as well?
I was responsible for her father.
When you went over there on Saturday.
Yes, sir. It's selfish, but it was something that's how I was thinking. It's something that has to be done if I don't want to be just, in prison for Martine.
The callousness involved in killing his wife, who was pregnant, while she's sleeping in bed next to him, then to kill her father, just as a way to try to pawn off the responsibility for the murder, is just so callous. It shows that he has no remorse or empathy whatsoever.
The opportunity came, my heart started racing. I just said 1, 2, 3, and then I did it. And all you see is he falls. And my heart was racing, and then he's still breathing. And I panicked, and I just did it again.
One's heart races for different reasons, right? I mean, your heart can race out of anxiety and fear, but it can also race because of excitement. There's something very empowering about making the decision to kill somebody, pointing a gun at someone's head, and then pulling the trigger.
Where did you leave him?
By the grass, yes.
So what did you do?
Tried to turn it into ashes. So I got the idea because I knew that if he came up deceased by another deceased person, it would cancel each other out, and no one's responsible.
You orchestrated this plan, right? If one deceased person killed another deceased person, they cancel each other out. Oh, correct, right?
Yes.
All right, very good. Do you need anything?
A second chance.
The night Sydney went quiet was the night someone vanished without a sound, and the city has never quite slept the same since. Because even now, decades later, there are streets that remember, pavements that seem to hold their breath. And a single unanswered question that once cracked open an entire community and never fully let it heal. It began with a routine evening, the kind no one writes down because nothing about it seems worth remembering. A late winter chill rolling in from the harbor, sodium streetlights flickering on one by one, pubs humming, buses exhaling tired passengers. And somewhere in the western suburbs, a woman locking her door, promising she'd be back soon, telling no one she felt watched, telling no one she felt the weight of the night pressing closer than usual. By morning, her car would be found parked crookedly along a quiet residential street. Keys gone, handbag still inside, radio frozen mid-song, and Sydney would wake to a headline that hit like a punch to the chest. Local woman missing, circumstances unclear, police seeking information. At first it sounded temporary, almost polite, as if the city itself expected her to walk back into her life by lunchtime. But the hours stretched, then the days, and the word missing hardened into something colder, heavier, more permanent. Neighbors replayed the night in fragments. A door closing, footsteps on concrete, a dog barking once and then stopping, a car engine that didn't belong. Maybe, or maybe did, memories already blurring as fear took hold, and police moved through the area with notebooks and flashlights. Their questions calm, procedural, masking the pressure already building behind their eyes. This was 1992, before phones tracked your every move, before cameras bloomed on every corner, when disappearance could still swallow a person whole and leave behind only shadows and speculation. The victim's name ran in print beside an ID photo that would soon become painfully familiar, clipped out and pinned to shop windows, taped to bus stops, held up by volunteers who walked street after street calling her name into the dark, hoping for an answer that never came. Her family spoke to reporters with stiff faces and shaking voices, insisting she wouldn't just leave, insisting something was wrong, and the word cold case hovered on the horizon like an approaching storm no one wanted to acknowledge. Police traced her last known movements in a widening circle: work colleagues, friends, a brief stop at a local shop, a sighting that might have been her crossing a road under a streetlight, or might have been someone else entirely, and every lead ended the same way, in uncertainty, in shrugs. In silence. A man came forward claiming he'd heard an argument late that night. Another said he saw a woman matching the description getting into a car, but descriptions shifted, details contradicted, and nothing stuck. Detectives walked through her house, noting what was untouched, what was missing, the absence of obvious struggle, the unsettling normality of everything left behind, as if she'd simply stepped out of frame. For weeks the investigation burned hot, phones ringing, tips flooding in, patrol cars cutting through the suburbs at all hours. But Sydney is vast, and secrets hide easily in its sprawl, and slowly the urgency dulled, replaced by routine, by paperwork, by the creeping sense that whatever happened had already slipped beyond reach. The media circled, sharpening the story into something more ominous, speculating, hinting, amplifying fear, and the community felt it in small ways: doors locked earlier, parents waiting longer at school gates, women gripping their keys tighter as they walked alone at night. This wasn't just one disappearance anymore. It was a warning, a rupture in the idea that ordinary life was safe, predictable, controllable. Police announced task forces, reviewed known offenders, combed through similar cases, but the file thickened without yielding answers, and before long, the language changed, the headlines colder, heavier. Mystery deepens, trail goes cold, family still waiting. The phrase Sydney 1992 cold case began to appear in quiet corners of reports, almost as an aside, but everyone knew what it meant, that the city was learning to live with a question mark where a person should be. Years passed, and the case drifted into the background, resurfacing only when an anniversary rolled around or a journalist decided to dig it up again, and each time the family was forced back into that first awful moment, repeating the same sentences, staring at the same photos, clinging to the same thin hope that somewhere, somehow, a mistake had been made, that she was alive, that she would come home. Detectives retired, new ones took their place, boxes were moved from desks to archives, from archives to storage, but the file remained, a stubborn presence, a reminder of unfinished business. Occasionally a tip would flare up, a call from someone claiming to know something, a confession that unraveled under scrutiny, a bone found that turned out to belong to an animal, and each false alarm took a little more out of everyone involved, leaving behind a weary resignation that this was how it would always be. Yet beneath the surface, the case never truly died, because unanswered questions have a way of burrowing into the collective conscience, and Sydney carried this one like a low-grade fever, barely noticeable until something made it spike. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic science prompted a quiet review, old evidence re-examined, items once dismissed now scrutinized under harsher light. But even technology couldn't conjure facts out of thin air, and again the trail faded. The family aged, parents growing frail, siblings building lives around a hole that could never be filled, birthdays marked by absence, holidays tinged with what-ifs, and still, no body, no explanation, no end. The city moved on, skyscrapers rising, suburbs changing. But in certain living rooms, the calendar seemed stuck in 1992, the night she didn't come home, replaying on an endless loop. Then, years later, something shifted, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a small anomaly noticed by someone who hadn't been there the first time, a detail overlooked, a name scribbled in the margin of an old report that suddenly looked wrong. It didn't make headlines, didn't trigger a press conference, but inside a police station, a box was opened again, dust shaken off, and questions were asked with fresh urgency. A witness was recontacted, older now, memory fragile but conscience heavier, and what emerged was not a clean answer, but a direction, a sense that the truth hadn't vanished, it had merely been waiting. Investigators followed the thread cautiously, aware of how many times hope had been raised and crushed before, aware of the weight of history pressing down on every decision. As the trail wound through past relationships, through places that no longer existed, through people who had built entire lives since that winter night, the atmosphere thickened, and those involved felt the familiar chill of a cold case stirring back to life. Records were pulled, timelines reconstructed, interviews replayed in the mind, and for the first time in years, the possibility of resolution hovered, fragile and terrifying. The family was notified that the case was active again, a sentence that landed with a mixture of dread and longing, reopening wounds they'd learned to live with, forcing them to imagine an ending they had never allowed themselves to fully believe in. Sydney, largely unaware, went about its business, but somewhere beneath the traffic and the noise, a story was accelerating toward a reckoning, the past pressing up against the present, demanding to be acknowledged. The disappearance that had once shocked a community was no longer just a memory. It was a living investigation again, carrying with it decades of unanswered questions, missteps, and quiet suffering. And as detectives leaned in closer, as old names resurfaced and new connections formed, one thing became clear: whether the truth would bring relief or devastation, it was coming, and when it did, it would ripple outward, forcing a city to look back at a night it thought it had buried, and a family to finally confront what had been waiting in the dark since 1992. The renewed investigation moved quietly at first, deliberately, as if the city itself might spook if anyone spoke too loudly, and inside interview rooms the air felt heavier than it had in years, thick with the awareness that time had not erased what happened. It had only hidden it under layers of routine and forgetting. Detectives leaned over yellowed reports, tracing names with their fingers, noticing patterns that had once seemed meaningless: a call logged too late, a sighting dismissed too quickly, a gap in the timeline that now looked less like coincidence and more like intention. One name kept resurfacing, never central enough to draw suspicion back then, always hovering just outside the frame, a peripheral figure connected by circumstance rather than proof, someone who had been spoken to briefly, cleared without ceremony, and allowed to slip back into anonymity while the case drifted toward cold. The kind of oversight no one notices until years later, when distance sharpens perspective and regret creeps in through the cracks. When police finally knocked on his door again, it was in a suburb that barely resembled the one from the early 90s. New houses, trimmed lawns, security cameras blinking silently, and a man answering with the practiced calm of someone who believed the past was sealed behind him. He was older now, heavier, hair gone gray at the temples, but his eyes flickered when the questions began, subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of reaction that only stands out when you're looking for it. He spoke carefully, measured, repeating what he had said decades earlier, insisting he remembered little, insisting he had nothing to hide. But memory is a fragile thing, and what had once sounded vague now rang rehearsed. Detectives left without arrest, without accusation, but with the unmistakable sense that the story was no longer as stable as it pretended to be. The next weeks unfolded in a rhythm both familiar and dangerous: surveillance, background checks, financial records pulled from archives, old phone logs examined like relics, and with each step the shape of the past grew sharper, darker. A relationship once described as casual now appeared strained. Phone calls once deemed insignificant now clustered around key moments, and a short, unexplained trip taken days after the disappearance suddenly demanded attention. None of it was proof, not yet, but together it formed a pressure point, a place where the narrative could no longer hold without cracking. Detectives spoke less about solving the case and more about understanding it, about reconstructing a night that had been flattened by time and rumor, and in doing so they began to feel the weight of every assumption made back in 1992. Every decision that had nudged the investigation down one path instead of another. Word reached the family slowly, filtered through official channels, cautious updates delivered with restrained optimism, and each conversation carried a tension that sat just below the surface, the unspoken fear that this, too, might collapse into nothing. They listened, nodded, asked careful questions, and then hung up and sat in silence, remembering how many times hope had been dangled in front of them before. For years they had lived with the idea that not knowing was somehow safer than knowing the worst, but now the possibility of truth, real and final, loomed closer, and it was terrifying. The city, unaware of these quiet developments, continued to hum, but in police stations and family homes the past was pressing forward, demanding resolution. A breakthrough came not in the form of a confession or a dramatic discovery, but through patience, through the slow accumulation of inconsistencies that refused to resolve. A witness from the original investigation, long considered unreliable, was contacted again, this time approached not with skepticism, but with empathy, and in the space created by that shift, something changed. He spoke of fear back then, of pressure, of things he hadn't said because he didn't think anyone would listen, details that didn't match the official record but matched each other in unsettling ways. His account placed the peripheral figure closer to the center, closer to the night's final moments, and though memory after so many years is a fragile thing, the emotional truth of what he described cut through the doubt. Forensic advances, limited as they were by the absence of a body, still offered new angles, old items tested again with techniques unavailable in the early 90s, microscopic traces that could now be interpreted rather than dismissed. Results trickled in slowly, each one adding weight to a case that had once seemed weightless, and while none alone could carry the burden of certainty, together they shifted the balance. Prosecutors were consulted, cautious, aware of the risks inherent in resurrecting a decades-old case, aware that the line between justice and collapse was razor-thin. Conversations grew tense, strategic, focused not on spectacle but on survivability, on whether the truth, once exposed, could withstand the harsh light of a courtroom. As pressure mounted, so did the suspect's isolation. Friends distanced themselves, routines changed, the quiet confidence he once carried replaced by a visible unease. And when police requested another interview, he arrived with a lawyer this time, posture rigid, answers shorter. The questions circled tighter, details pressed harder, and cracks began to show, small contradictions, moments of hesitation where there should have been certainty. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to confirm that the calm exterior was no longer intact. After the interview, detectives sat in silence, replaying it in their minds, knowing they were closer than they had ever been, and equally aware of how easily it could still slip away. The decision to move forward came late one night, after hours of debate and review, after acknowledging both the strength and the fragility of what they had built. An arrest, even a tentative one, would send shockwaves through the family, through the community, through the city's memory of itself, but hesitation now felt like another form of failure. When the suspect was taken into custody, it was without fanfare, no cameras, no crowd, just the quiet click of handcuffs in a suburban street, and for those present, the moment carried a gravity that words struggled to capture. Somewhere, phones began to ring, officials informing the family that something significant had happened, that answers might finally be within reach. The news broke cautiously at first, a brief mention buried in the evening reports, a reference to a 1992 cold case reopened, an arrest made in connection with a long unsolved disappearance. The reaction was immediate and visceral, social media buzzing, talkback radio lighting up, people dredging up half-remembered details, old fears resurfacing alongside a collective disbelief that this story, so long dormant, was moving again. For the family, the world narrowed to a single point, a mix of relief and dread twisting together. The realization that the truth they had waited for might finally be revealed, but that it might also be unbearable. In the days that followed, as legal processes unfolded and the city leaned in closer, detectives prepared to present a narrative that spanned decades, one that would have to bridge the gap between who people had been in 1992 and who they were now. Evidence was organized, witnesses prepared, timelines reconstructed with meticulous care, and still, uncertainty lingered, the knowledge that even now, the absence of a body cast a long shadow over everything. Yet for the first time in years, the question was no longer whether the case would remain unsolved, but what the solution would cost, who it would hurt, and whether closure, if it came, would truly quiet the echoes that had haunted Sydney since that winter night. As the story gathered momentum, as reporters sharpened their language and headlines hinted at resolution, those closest to the case felt the strain of standing at the edge of something irreversible. The cold case that had once symbolized absence and failure was transforming into something else entirely, a reckoning, a confrontation with the past that would force everyone involved to revisit what they thought they knew. And in that charged space, between silence and truth, the city waited, holding its breath, aware that whatever emerged next would not just close a file, but rewrite a chapter of its own history that had been left open for far too long. The court date arrived without ceremony, a line on a calendar that carried the weight of 3 decades, and as the legal machinery creaked into motion, the story shifted from quiet rooms and confidential briefings into the harsh public light where every word mattered and every silence was dissected. Outside the courthouse, cameras gathered, reporters murmured, old headlines were resurrected and reframed, and the phrase Sydney 1992 cold case was suddenly everywhere again, stripped of its dust and presented as something urgent, alive, unfinished. Inside, the family sat together, closer than usual, hands clasped too tightly, faces set in expressions they had rehearsed in private but never expected to display under fluorescent lights, knowing that what followed would not just recount a disappearance, it would redefine it. Prosecutors began carefully, aware that they were asking the court to travel back to a time before smartphones and digital footprints, before certainty could be pulled from a database with a few keystrokes. They spoke of a winter night, of movements and gaps, of relationships that appeared ordinary until examined under pressure, and as they laid out the sequence, the past unfolded again, methodical and relentless. The accused sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, a study in restraint, while behind him the gallery leaned forward, straining to connect this aging figure with the younger man described in testimony, the one who had existed in 1992, when a woman walked out into the cold and never returned. Witnesses followed, some familiar from the original investigation, others new, their voices carrying the strain of memory stretched thin. One spoke of seeing a car where it shouldn't have been, another of hearing raised voices and thinking nothing of it at the time, still another of a conversation that had seemed trivial then, but now felt heavy with implication. Defense attorneys challenged each account, pointing to inconsistencies, to the unreliability of recollection after so many years, and the courtroom filled with the tension of competing truths, the uncomfortable reality that time distorts even the most sincere testimony. Still, as fragments accumulated, a picture began to form, incomplete but unsettling, suggesting intent where once there had been only uncertainty. The absence of a body loomed over everything, an unspoken presence that defense and prosecution alike circled without fully confronting. It was the void at the center of the case, the question that had haunted the family and confounded investigators for decades, and now it became the focal point of legal argument, raised as doubt, countered as circumstance. Prosecutors spoke of concealment, of opportunity, of the many ways a person could vanish without leaving physical proof, while the defense leaned hard on the lack of finality, the lack of a definitive end. The jury listened, faces guarded, absorbing a story that demanded both imagination and restraint, asking them to bridge gaps with logic rather than certainty. Outside the courtroom, Sydney reacted in waves, talkback radio buzzing with opinions, social feeds filling with amateur theories, people revisiting their own memories of 1992, where they were, what they felt when the news first broke. The case became a mirror, reflecting the city's evolving relationship with crime, with trust, with the belief that time eventually brings answers. Some expressed relief that justice might finally be served, others unease at the thought of a conviction built on circumstantial threads, and beneath it all ran a current of anxiety, the recognition that if this could happen once, it could happen again, quietly, without warning. As the trial progressed, pressure mounted on everyone involved, particularly the family, who found themselves reliving their loss in public, each detail reopening wounds they had learned to endure in private. They listened as the prosecution described the final known moments of their loved one's life, the mundane actions that now felt painfully significant, and they listened as the defense attempted to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. At night, they returned home exhausted, the day's testimony echoing in their minds, aware that no verdict could truly give them back what had been taken, yet still desperate for the clarity they had been denied for so long. Midway through the proceedings, a moment arrived that shifted the atmosphere in the room, subtle but undeniable, when a piece of evidence long considered marginal was reframed, its significance suddenly clear. It was not dramatic, not the kind of revelation that draws gasps, but its implications rippled outward, tightening the narrative in a way that was difficult to ignore. The defense pushed back hard, questioning its validity, its interpretation, its timing, but the seed had been planted, and as arguments continued, it took root in the collective consciousness of the courtroom. Observers sensed it, that slight change in tone, the sense that the balance was no longer neutral. The accused took the stand late in the trial, a decision that carried enormous risk, and as he spoke, the years seemed to compress, his words weaving together past and present in a fragile attempt at coherence. He denied involvement, denied knowledge, painted himself as another victim of circumstance, caught in the undertow of a tragedy he did not create. Under cross-examination, his composure wavered, small cracks appearing as timelines were challenged and prior statements revisited. And though he never broke completely, the effort of maintaining his version of events was visible, the strain etched into his posture. The courtroom watched closely, aware that this was likely the closest they would come to the truth in human form. Closing arguments arrived with a sense of inevitability, both sides distilling years of investigation and weeks of testimony into narratives meant to persuade and endure. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, of the quiet violence of erasure, of a life taken not with spectacle but with calculation, urging the jury to see the absence of evidence not as absence of guilt, but as its consequence. The defense countered with caution, with the principle that doubt must always favor the accused, warning against the seductive pull of closure at the expense of justice. As the jury filed out to deliberate, the room exhaled, tension giving way to a fragile, collective waiting. The hours stretched into days, the city holding its breath as updates filtered through the media, speculation filling the gaps left by official silence. For the family, waiting was nothing new, but this was different, heavier, charged with the knowledge that an answer, one way or another, was imminent. They spoke little, conserving energy, bracing for impact, knowing that even a guilty verdict would not neatly resolve the past, that truth, when it arrived, might complicate rather than soothe. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a quiet determination, a resolve that whatever happened, the silence that had defined their lives for decades was finally breaking. When the jury returned, the courtroom filled again, every seat occupied, every eye fixed on the foreperson, and in that moment before the verdict was read, time seemed to slow, the weight of 1992 pressing down on the present. The words that followed would travel far beyond those walls, into living rooms and newsrooms, into the collective memory of a city that had grown older alongside this unresolved story. Whatever the outcome, the cold case was no longer dormant, no longer a footnote, but a living reckoning, forcing Sydney to confront not just what happened all those years ago, but how it had carried that absence forward, and what it would mean to finally, irrevocably know. The verdict did not fall like a hammer. It slid into the room with a slow, devastating weight, each word pronounced carefully, deliberately, as if the court itself understood the consequences of what was being said, and in that moment the decades collapsed into a single breath held too long. The jury's decision rippled outward instantly, cameras flashing, pens scratching, a murmur swelling into noise. But for the family, everything went quiet, a strange, muffled silence where relief and grief collided without warning. Guilty, the foreperson said, and the word hung there, heavy, irreversible, carrying with it the promise of truth and the certainty that nothing could ever truly be the same again. The accused remained still, face unreadable, while around him the machinery of justice began to turn toward sentencing, toward finality, toward an ending that had been denied for so long. Outside, Sydney reacted as cities do when a long-buried story suddenly finds its conclusion, shock first, then disbelief, then a flood of commentary that tried to make sense of it all. Headlines broke across screens within minutes, declaring the 1992 cold case closed, justice delayed but delivered, a family learning the truth after decades of waiting, and the language was sharp, decisive, confident in a way the reality could never fully support. Talkback hosts dissected every detail. Commentators argued over whether the evidence had been enough, whether the verdict brought comfort or merely reopened wounds. And in cafes and offices people spoke in hushed tones, remembering where they had been when the woman first disappeared. Realizing how much of their own lives had unfolded in the shadow of that unanswered question. For the family, the aftermath was not a celebration but a reckoning, an emotional terrain far more complex than anyone watching from the outside could understand. They were ushered into quiet rooms, shielded from cameras, offered water they barely touched, and as officials explained the next steps, the reality of what they had learned began to sink in. The truth, when it arrived, did not bring peace so much as clarity, a sharp, cutting clarity that stripped away decades of speculation and replaced it with something solid and unforgiving. They now knew what had happened, who had been responsible, and that knowledge carried its own weight, a burden they would have to learn to carry just as they had carried uncertainty. In the days that followed, sentencing hearings laid bare details that had never been spoken publicly, a reconstruction of events that filled in the final hours of a life frozen in time since 1992. Prosecutors described actions taken under cover of darkness, choices made in moments that altered countless lives, and though much remained circumstantial, the narrative was firm enough now to stand without apology. The absence of a body was addressed head-on, framed not as a failure of proof, but as a deliberate act, a final attempt to erase a person completely. Listening to it, the family felt a strange duality, gratitude that the story was finally being told, and anguish at hearing it spoken aloud, rendered into legal language that could never capture the human cost. The judge's remarks echoed through the courtroom, emphasizing accountability, the enduring impact of violence, and the long shadow cast by unresolved crime. And as the sentence was handed down, there was a sense of history closing in on itself. The man who had lived freely for decades was led away, his future abruptly narrowed, while the family was left to grapple with what freedom meant for them now that the truth was known. Outside, reporters pressed forward, microphones raised, asking how it felt, whether they felt closure, whether justice had been served, and each question landed like an intrusion, an attempt to simplify something that defied neat answers. Sydney absorbed the outcome slowly, the initial shock giving way to a more reflective mood. As articles revisited the investigation's missteps, the missed opportunities, the cultural and technological limitations of the early 90s that had allowed the case to drift into cold. Police leadership acknowledged the failures without defensiveness, emphasizing lessons learned, reforms implemented, and the importance of revisiting unresolved cases, but the acknowledgments came with an implicit understanding that apologies could never fully compensate for years of waiting. Years of not knowing. The cold case, now officially closed, became a case study, cited in training rooms and conferences as both a cautionary tale and a testament to persistence. Yet, even as the system moved on, the story refused to settle neatly into the past, because closure is not an event, it is a process, and for those most affected, it unfolded unevenly, unpredictably. The family returned home to a house filled with reminders, photos that now seemed to belong to another life, letters written in hope and desperation, objects kept for no reason other than that they had once belonged to her. They spoke more openly now, sharing memories without the constant ache of not knowing how the story ended. But the pain did not diminish so much as transform, shifting from uncertainty to mourning, from endless waiting to the work of grief long postponed. Public interest gradually waned, as it always does, headlines replaced by new crises, new scandals, new tragedies. But the case left a residue in the city's collective memory, a reminder of how easily a person could disappear and how long it could take for the truth to surface. Some questioned whether justice delayed could ever truly be justice. Others took comfort in the idea that persistence mattered, that even decades later, answers could be found. The debate played out in opinion columns and late-night conversations, reflecting a broader anxiety about safety, accountability, and the stories that remained buried beneath the surface of everyday life. For detectives who had worked the case in its final years, the outcome was both vindication and burden, a confirmation that their instincts had been right, paired with the sobering realization of how close the truth had been all along. They spoke privately about the turning points, the small decisions that had reopened the file, the moments when they had nearly given up, and the responsibility they felt toward the family, toward the woman whose name had filled their days and nights. Solving the case had not brought triumph so much as humility, an awareness of the limits of investigation and the profound consequences of delay. As time passed, the language surrounding the case softened, shifting from the urgency of breaking news to the reflective tone of retrospectives, documentaries, and long-form pieces that sought to capture its complexity. Filmmakers and writers revisited the story, emphasizing its human dimensions, the way it had shaped a family and a city, the way it illustrated both the fragility and resilience of memory. Each retelling added another layer, another perspective, ensuring that the woman at the center was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person whose life had mattered long before it became a headline. And still, beneath all of it, lingered an unease that no verdict could fully dispel, the recognition that knowing the truth did not erase the years it had taken to uncover it, nor the possibility that other stories remained unresolved, other names waiting in boxes on shelves. The Sydney 1992 cold case was closed, officially, decisively, but its echo continued to reverberate, a reminder that the past is never truly past, that it waits patiently for the moment when someone is willing to look again. In quiet streets under familiar streetlights, life went on, but for those who listened closely, there was a sense that the city itself remembered, carrying forward the lesson of a winter night when someone vanished and the long, arduous journey it took to finally bring that disappearance into the light. Time did not rush in to fill the space the verdict left behind. It seeped instead, slow and uneven, forcing everyone touched by the case to adjust to a new reality where the question mark that had dominated their lives was finally replaced by a period. In the weeks after sentencing, the family discovered that knowing the truth did not quiet the noise in their heads. It changed it, transforming decades of imagined endings into a single, official version that now played on repeat. They woke at odd hours, replaying details revealed in court, small moments they wished they had never heard, and others they clung to desperately, fragments that made their loved one feel close again, briefly alive in memory rather than frozen in absence. Friends reached out, offering congratulations that felt misplaced, condolences that felt late, and the family learned to nod, to thank, to retreat inward when the words no longer fit the emotions they carried. Police closed files, logged outcomes, and moved on to other cases, but privately many of those involved felt the aftershock, the lingering sense that solving a cold case was less like winning a battle and more like arriving too late to stop a fire that had already burned everything down. Younger officers listened as veterans spoke about 1992, about what the city had been like then, about the blind spots that seemed obvious only in hindsight, and those conversations carried a quiet urgency, a hope that the past could still teach something useful. Training sessions referenced the case not as a triumph, but as a warning, a reminder that early assumptions calcify quickly, that every overlooked detail has the potential to stretch into decades of pain. The media, relentless at first, gradually shifted tone, producing longer pieces that traced the emotional arc rather than the procedural milestones. Interviewing neighbors who remembered the night of the disappearance, classmates who recalled the shock rippling through schools, colleagues who spoke of an empty desk that had never quite been filled. These stories added texture, humanizing a name that had spent years reduced to a headline. And in doing so, they reopened conversations about safety, about trust, about how communities absorb trauma and carry it forward without always acknowledging its weight. Sydney read, watched, listened, and slowly integrated the outcome into its collective memory, another layer added to the city's complex relationship with crime and consequence. For the family, the most difficult moments often arrived unexpectedly, triggered by ordinary things: a familiar song on the radio, a street corner glimpsed from a bus, the smell of winter air rolling in off the harbor. Grief, long suspended by uncertainty, surged with renewed force now that it had somewhere to land, and they found themselves mourning not only the person they had lost, but the years spent waiting, the lives they might have lived differently if the truth had come sooner. Therapy sessions replaced police briefings, quiet conversations replaced press conferences, and healing became a private, uneven process, invisible to a public that had already begun to move on. There were practical matters too, legal formalities, paperwork that finally acknowledged death where once there had been only disappearance, decisions about belongings preserved for decades in the hope of return. Each choice carried emotional weight, forcing the family to confront the finality they had resisted for so long. And yet there was a strange relief in it, a sense that they were no longer suspended in an endless present. They could mark time again, could say before and after, could begin to build a narrative that did not hinge entirely on what they did not know. The convicted man faded from public view, becoming another name in the correctional system, his story reduced to legal summaries and footnotes in articles about cold cases solved. Speculation lingered, as it always does, questions about motive, about moments never fully explained, about whether he had acted alone or carried secrets to the grave of silence. Those questions found homes in online forums and late-night debates. But for the family, the details mattered less now than the certainty of responsibility, the confirmation that what they had long suspected was not a product of fear or imagination. The truth, imperfect as it was, gave them something solid to stand on. As months passed, the city's attention drifted, but the case left subtle marks, influencing policy discussions, prompting renewed funding for cold case units, encouraging families of other missing persons to push again for answers. Detectives revisited old files with fresh eyes, inspired by the idea that time did not have to mean defeat, and though not every story would end the same way, the Sydney 1992 case became a symbol of persistence, proof that even deeply buried truths could resurface. For some, it offered hope, for others a reminder of how long justice could take, but for all, it underscored the human cost of delay. Anniversaries arrived with a different tone now, less frantic, more reflective, marked by quiet gatherings rather than press appeals. The family lit candles, shared stories, allowed laughter alongside tears, and for the first time in decades, they spoke of the future without feeling as though they were betraying the past. The absence remained, permanent and undeniable, but it no longer dominated every thought, no longer defined every relationship. They were learning, slowly, how to live in a world where the mystery was gone but the loss remained. In the wider community, conversations sparked by the case began to fade, replaced by new concerns, yet something had shifted beneath the surface, an increased awareness of vulnerability, of the thin line between ordinary nights and irreversible ones. Parents lingered a little longer when saying goodbye, neighbors paid closer attention to unfamiliar sounds, and the city carried on with a subtle, collective caution shaped in part by the memory of a woman who had vanished and a truth that had taken decades to emerge. The cold case, now officially resolved, settled into history, its documents archived, its lessons distilled, but its emotional resonance persisted, a low hum beneath the noise of daily life. For those who had lived with it, worked on it, or been shaped by it, the story did not end with a verdict or a sentence. It continued in quieter ways, in changed perspectives, in an enduring awareness of how fragile certainty can be. And as Sydney moved forward, illuminated by new lights and new stories, the shadow of 1992 remained, not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible, instructive, and impossible to ignore, a testament to a long night, a long wait, and the complicated aftermath of finally knowing. Even as the case receded from the front pages, its gravity lingered in quieter spaces, in the private moments when the world slowed enough for memory to surface without warning. For the family, life after truth was a process of constant recalibration, learning how to exist without the daily ache of uncertainty while still carrying the weight of what had been revealed. They discovered that closure was not a door that shut cleanly, but a corridor that twisted, sometimes looping back on itself, sometimes opening into rooms they hadn't known existed. Ordinary decisions felt different now, no longer postponed by the hope of a return, and with that came a strange guilt, the sense that moving forward might somehow erase the past they had fought so hard to uncover. In police circles, the case became a reference point spoken of in lowered voices, not because it was sensational, but because it was sobering. Detectives who had worked the file late in their careers found themselves replaying early missteps, wondering how different the outcome might have been if certain questions had been asked sooner, if certain assumptions had been challenged. Younger officers listened closely, absorbing the lesson that time is not neutral in an investigation, that every delay compounds the difficulty of truth, and that cold cases are not frozen in place. They are slowly decaying, memories fading, evidence eroding, lives moving on. The Sydney 1992 case, closed at last, served as a reminder that persistence could redeem some of that loss, but never all of it. The community most directly affected, the neighborhood where the disappearance began, felt the aftershocks in subtle ways. Residents who had lived there in the early 90s compared memories, realizing how differently they had experienced the same event, how fear had settled into some lives and barely touched others. New families, unaware of the history, moved into renovated houses, unaware that certain streets carried stories older residents still whispered about. Occasionally, someone would point out a driveway or a stretch of sidewalk and say quietly, "That's where it started," and for a moment the past would bleed into the present, reminding everyone that geography remembers even when people try to forget. The absence of physical remains continued to haunt the narrative, even after conviction, a gap that no legal ruling could fully fill. Forensic experts spoke publicly about the challenges of cases without bodies, about how absence itself can be evidence, but also about the emotional toll such cases take on families denied the ritual of farewell. The family wrestled with this privately, torn between gratitude for answers and a lingering longing for something tangible, a place to grieve that was not purely symbolic. Memorials took on greater significance, candles and plaques standing in for a body that never came home, and in these acts of remembrance, they carved out a space where mourning could finally take shape. Public discussions sparked by the case began to shift focus away from the specifics of the crime and toward broader questions about institutional memory and accountability. Commentators asked how many other cases lay dormant in archives, how many families were still waiting for a phone call that might never come. Advocacy groups cited the Sydney case as proof that revisiting old investigations mattered, lobbying for dedicated funding and resources, arguing that justice should not expire simply because time had passed. These conversations did not always lead to immediate change, but they planted seeds, influencing policy debates and shaping public expectations in ways that would echo beyond this single story. For the family, encounters with strangers took on a new dimension, people recognizing their names, offering words of support, sometimes oversharing their own experiences of loss and waiting. These interactions were both comforting and exhausting, reminders that their private pain had become a public narrative, consumed and analyzed by people who would never fully understand it. They learned to set boundaries, to choose when to speak and when to retreat, protecting what little peace they had carved out after decades of exposure. Silence, once their enemy, now became a refuge, a space where healing could occur without commentary or judgment. The convicted man's silence after sentencing fueled ongoing speculation. unanswered questions multiplying in the absence of explanation. Some wondered whether he would ever confess fully, whether he would reveal details still unknown, or whether the truth presented in court was all there ever would be. Psychologists weighed in, discussing the psychology of denial and secrecy, the reasons some perpetrators cling to partial truths even when the consequences are already sealed. For the family, these debates were distant and abstract, the motivations less important than the acknowledgement of responsibility, the confirmation that what happened was real and not a product of endless imagining. As years turned, the case found its way into academic studies and criminal justice curricula, analyzed for what it revealed about investigative bias, resource allocation, and the evolution of forensic science. Students debated the evidence, argued about thresholds of proof, and in doing so, treated the story as a learning tool, a way to sharpen critical thinking. For those who had lived through it, this abstraction was unsettling, a reminder that real lives underpin every case study, every hypothetical discussion. Yet there was also a measure of solace in knowing that something constructive might emerge from the pain, that future investigations might be improved by the lessons learned here. The family marked milestones quietly, birthdays and anniversaries taking on new meanings now that the narrative had an ending, however painful. They spoke of their loved one more freely, sharing stories that had once felt dangerous, as if speaking too vividly might invite disappointment. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then stronger, not because the loss had diminished, but because it no longer competed with the constant question of what had happened. Grief settled into a rhythm, no longer consuming every moment, but still present, a companion rather than an adversary. In the broader cultural landscape, the fascination with cold cases continued, fueled by podcasts, documentaries, and streaming series that promised resolution and insight. The Sydney 1992 case was referenced often, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes sensationally, its details condensed into narratives designed to captivate rather than heal. This commercialization of tragedy stirred mixed reactions, some grateful for renewed attention on unresolved crimes, others uneasy with the transformation of suffering into entertainment. The family watched from a distance, choosing carefully when to engage, aware that the story no longer belonged solely to them, yet determined to protect its dignity where they could. Through it all, the city carried on, its rhythms unchanged on the surface, ferries crossing the harbor, traffic humming along familiar routes. But beneath that normalcy lay an accumulation of stories like this one, each shaping the collective sense of safety and vulnerability. The Sydney 1992 cold case, now closed, joined that hidden archive, influencing how people thought about disappearance, about trust, about the long reach of the past. It reminded the city that answers can arrive late, that justice can be delayed without being denied, but also that no resolution is without cost. As the family looked toward the future, they did so with a cautious resolve, aware that healing would never be complete, but determined that it would be genuine. They carried forward the memory of the woman at the center of it all, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a person whose life had meaning beyond the way it ended. In that choice, there was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let the cold case define her entirely, even as it remained an indelible part of her story. And in the spaces where silence once screamed, there was now room for something else, fragile but real, the possibility of living fully in the aftermath of finally knowing. The years that followed did not soften the story so much as stretch it out, allowing its edges to blur while its core remained sharp. And for those who had lived inside it, the case became less an event and more a permanent reference point. A before and after line running quietly through everything else. The family noticed it most in moments of calm, when nothing was wrong, and yet something felt different, an awareness that the long vigil was over, replaced by a quieter, heavier responsibility to live with what they now knew. There was no longer a need to imagine every possible ending, but the single confirmed truth demanded space, demanded acknowledgement, demanded a kind of courage they were still learning how to summon. In private, conversations shifted from investigation to meaning, from what happened to what it meant to survive something that had defined them for so long. They talked about who they had become during the years of not knowing, about the choices shaped by absence, the paths taken and avoided, and whether those versions of themselves would fade now that the mystery no longer dictated their lives. Some felt relief at the thought of shedding that identity. Others felt unmoored, unsure who they were without the constant tension of waiting. Grief counselors spoke of this transition as a second loss, the loss of purpose that comes when a long-held question finally has an answer, and the family recognized themselves in that description more than they expected. The legal finality of the case brought administrative closure, but emotionally, the ending remained open-ended, a story without a neat final chapter. Appeals were discussed in abstract terms, filed and denied with little fanfare, procedural steps that barely registered compared to the emotional upheaval already endured. Each update arrived like an echo rather than a shock, reinforcing the sense that the most significant moment had already passed, that whatever came next would be footnotes rather than revelations. The family followed these developments at a distance, informed but no longer consumed, determined not to let the process reclaim the space it once occupied. In the wider community, the case began to take on a mythic quality, retold with slight variations, details emphasized or softened depending on who was telling it and why. Older residents recalled the fear of the early 90s, the way the disappearance had punctured a sense of suburban safety, while younger people encountered the story as history, something already resolved before they were old enough to understand it. This generational divide altered the tone of remembrance, shifting it from raw trauma to cautionary tale, and in doing so, it revealed how time reshapes even the most unsettling events. Police departments across the country quietly reviewed their own dormant files, spurred in part by the visibility of the Sydney case. And while few yielded similar outcomes, the act of revisiting itself carried symbolic weight. It signaled an acknowledgement that unresolved cases are not static failures, but ongoing obligations, responsibilities that do not expire simply because they are inconvenient or complex. Investigators spoke about morale, about how solving even one long cold case could reaffirm the purpose of their work, reminding them that persistence mattered, even when success was far from guaranteed. For the family, public recognition of the case's impact brought mixed emotions, gratitude that the suffering had not been ignored, discomfort at its continued visibility. Invitations arrived to speak at forums, to participate in panels about cold cases and victim advocacy, and each request forced a decision about how much of their story they were willing to share. Sometimes they said yes, believing that speaking might help others still waiting. Other times they declined, choosing privacy over purpose, aware that they were allowed to step back after so many years of exposure. Their story, they realized, did not owe anyone continued access. Memory itself became a complex terrain, shaped now by confirmed facts rather than speculation. And this shift altered how they remembered the person they had lost. Without the constant pull of unanswered questions, memories surfaced more organically, moments unconnected to the disappearance, laughter, habits, small quirks that had been overshadowed by the mystery for decades. This reclaiming of memory felt like an act of resistance, a way to assert that her life was larger than the crime that ended it, that she existed fully before becoming a headline. In these moments, grief softened, allowing space for warmth alongside sorrow. The convicted man's continued silence remained a source of unresolved tension, a reminder that legal truth and emotional truth are not always aligned. Some believed he would eventually speak, compelled by age, by conscience, by the erosion of time, while others suspected he would take whatever remained with him, leaving certain questions forever unanswered. The family oscillated between these possibilities, sometimes longing for further explanation, sometimes relieved that the narrative would not be complicated by new revelations. In the end, they came to understand that waiting for his words risked re-entering a cycle they had finally escaped, and they chose, deliberately, not to hinge their healing on a confession that might never come. As the case settled into history, it began to influence how people talked about disappearance itself, challenging the assumption that unresolved cases simply fade away. Commentators pointed out how the absence of answers does not dull pain but prolongs it, how families live in a suspended state that complicates every aspect of life. The Sydney case became an example cited not only for its eventual resolution, but for the human cost of delay, the years spent in limbo that no verdict could restore. This reframing shifted the narrative from triumph to caution, emphasizing empathy over spectacle. In the family's daily lives, routines regained their importance, grounding them in the present, offering stability after years defined by disruption. Ordinary milestones were celebrated without guilt, achievements acknowledged without apology, and slowly, the future stopped feeling like a betrayal of the past. They learned that honoring memory did not require perpetual suffering, that love could persist without constant pain, and that moving forward was not an erasure but an evolution. This understanding did not come easily or evenly, but it took hold, shaping a quieter, more sustainable way of living with loss. The city itself seemed to absorb the lesson in subtle ways, its relationship with crime reporting and public memory shifting slightly toward depth rather than immediacy. Long-form journalism found renewed interest, focusing on context and consequence rather than shock, and in this space, the Sydney 1992 case was revisited with a maturity absent from its earliest coverage. Writers explored the intersections of policy, culture, and personal tragedy, situating the case within a broader conversation about how societies remember and respond to violence. These narratives did not seek to reopen wounds, but to understand them. And so the story continued, not as a breaking news alert or a courtroom drama, but as an undercurrent, influencing thought, shaping attitudes, reminding those who encountered it that resolution is rarely simple and never complete. The cold case, though closed, remained alive in the ways it altered lives, institutions, and perspectives, a testament to the enduring impact of unanswered questions and the complicated relief of finally finding answers. In that space between knowing and healing, the family and the city learned to coexist with a truth that had taken decades to surface, carrying it forward not as a burden to be hidden, but as a reality to be acknowledged, understood, and lived with. With distance came a different kind of clarity, one that did not arrive all at once, but accumulated quietly, reshaping how the story was held rather than how it was told. The family noticed it in the way memories surfaced now, less jagged, more whole, no longer interrupted by the reflexive question of what might have happened next. They could remember her without immediately colliding with the moment she vanished, could let conversations drift back to shared jokes, to routines so ordinary they had once seemed unworthy of notice. This shift did not diminish the loss, it reframed it, allowing grief to coexist with a fuller sense of who she had been, beyond the narrow lens of the crime. The cold case's influence extended outward, touching people who had never known her, who encountered the story as an example rather than a lived reality. University lectures referenced it when discussing investigative persistence. Ethics seminars debated the responsibilities owed to families waiting for answers. And community forums used it to spark conversations about how society measures justice when time stretches the distance between act and accountability. In these settings, the case became less about spectacle and more about consequence, a way to examine the long shadows cast by violence and the systems designed to address it. Within law enforcement, the case prompted subtle but meaningful shifts, a renewed emphasis on documentation, on preserving evidence with the assumption that future eyes would revisit it, armed with tools and perspectives not yet imagined. Detectives spoke about the importance of humility, about recognizing that certainty can be an illusion, especially in the early stages of an investigation. The Sydney 1992 file, once a symbol of frustration, now served as a quiet mentor, reminding those who opened it that every decision echoes forward, sometimes for decades. For the family, these institutional changes brought a complicated comfort, a sense that their suffering might at least contribute to preventing others from enduring the same prolonged uncertainty. They engaged selectively with advocacy efforts, supporting initiatives aimed at improving cold case resources and victim support without allowing activism to consume them. Their involvement was measured, intentional, guided by the understanding that they could not fix the system, but they could influence it in small, meaningful ways. In doing so, they reclaimed a sense of agency that had been stripped away on the night she disappeared. Public memory continued to evolve, shaped by documentaries that favored nuance over sensationalism, by articles that centered on impact rather than intrigue. The story was told more carefully now, with attention to the emotional cost borne by those left behind. And this shift was not accidental. It reflected a broader fatigue with shallow true crime narratives and a growing appetite for depth and responsibility. Audiences responded, engaging with the case not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a human experience to be understood, and in that engagement, the tone of discourse softened. The physical landscape of Sydney bore quiet traces of the past, though most passers-by remained unaware of their significance. Streets had been renamed, buildings replaced, yet certain corners still carried a weight for those who remembered, a subtle sense that something had happened there that could not be fully erased. The family occasionally revisited these places, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to reconcile memory with reality, to see how the world had continued even as theirs had paused. These visits were bittersweet, grounding them in the present while honoring the past. The absence of a grave continued to shape their mourning, but over time, rituals evolved to fill that gap. Anniversaries were marked with deliberate acts of remembrance, donations made in her name, gatherings held where stories were shared and laughter was permitted without guilt. These practices transformed mourning into something active rather than static, a way to keep her presence integrated into their lives rather than confined to a single date or place. In this, they found a measure of peace that had once seemed unattainable. The convicted man receded further into obscurity, his name appearing only occasionally in reports about parole reviews or institutional transfers. Each mention stirred a brief ripple of emotion, quickly replaced by a practiced detachment, a refusal to let his trajectory dictate their own. The family learned to acknowledge these updates without internalizing them, understanding that justice, once rendered, did not require constant reaffirmation. Their focus shifted decisively away from him and back toward themselves, toward rebuilding lives that had been on hold for far too long. As cultural conversations about crime and justice continued to evolve, the Sydney case was sometimes invoked as evidence of progress, sometimes as a caution against complacency. It served both roles, a reminder that systems can fail and later correct themselves, but also that correction does not erase harm. This duality made the story enduring, relevant long after its legal conclusion, and ensured that it remained part of a larger dialogue rather than an isolated anecdote. In the family's daily routines, the future slowly regained definition, plans made without the unspoken caveat of uncertainty, milestones anticipated rather than deferred. They spoke about travel, about careers, about joys that had once felt frivolous in the face of unresolved loss, and in doing so, they reclaimed parts of themselves that had been dormant. The process was not linear, setbacks arrived without warning, but the overall trajectory bent toward life, toward engagement, toward the acceptance that healing did not require forgetting. The city, in its vastness, continued to generate new stories, new headlines, new tragedies, yet beneath that constant churn lay a cumulative wisdom, shaped in part by cases like this one. The Sydney 1992 cold case had left its imprint, influencing how disappearances were perceived, how families were treated, how patience and persistence were valued. It reminded those willing to listen that behind every unresolved file lies a network of lives suspended and waiting, and that when answers finally come, they carry both relief and responsibility. And so the narrative settled into a quieter rhythm, no longer driven by urgency or revelation, but by reflection. The cold case, once a symbol of absence, had become a source of insight, its meaning shifting as those touched by it continued to live, adapt, and remember. In that ongoing process, the family found a fragile equilibrium, a way to hold both loss and continuity, to acknowledge the past without being consumed by it. The truth had come late, but it had come, and in its wake, there was space, imperfect and hard-won, for life to continue, carrying forward not just the memory of what was taken, but the enduring resilience of those left behind. As more time passed, the case slipped further into the background of everyday conversation, yet it never fully disappeared, existing instead as a low, steady presence in the collective awareness, resurfacing when someone mentioned a similar disappearance or when a new cold case made the news. For the family, These moments arrived like faint echoes, reminders of how easily the past could be summoned by an unrelated headline or a familiar phrase. They learned to navigate these reminders with a practiced calm, acknowledging the connection without allowing it to reopen wounds that had only just begun to scar over. The story's endurance lay not in its details, which had been examined and re-examined to exhaustion, but in the questions it raised about time, justice, and memory. Academics wrote about it as an example of temporal distance in criminal accountability, exploring how juries interpret evidence decades after the fact and how narratives shift as social norms evolve. These analyses treated the case as a lens through which to examine broader truths, and while the abstraction felt strange to those who had lived it, there was also a sense of validation in seeing the experience recognized as significant beyond its immediate tragedy. Within the family, generational perspectives emerged, younger relatives who had grown up knowing the story only in fragments, now engaging with it more fully as adults. They asked questions, sought context, tried to understand how the years of uncertainty had shaped the people who raised them. These conversations were tender and sometimes painful, but they also offered an opportunity to pass on lessons learned about resilience, about advocacy, about the importance of not letting unanswered questions define one's entire existence. In this way, the case became part of a family narrative that emphasized survival as much as loss. The legal system, having rendered its judgment, moved on with procedural efficiency, but its interaction with the case did not end entirely. Periodic reviews, mandatory assessments, and the slow grind of institutional oversight ensured that the outcome remained active in a technical sense, even as its emotional intensity waned. For the family, these processes were reminders that closure is not a single event, but a series of reaffirmations, each one smaller than the last, each one requiring less emotional investment. Over time, these updates became background noise rather than central disruptions. Media treatments of the case grew less frequent but more reflective, anniversary pieces that focused on lessons learned rather than sensational details. Journalists who revisited the story years later did so with a different sensibility, aware of the harm caused by speculation and the responsibility inherent in retelling real lives. This evolution in tone mirrored a broader shift in how crime stories were consumed, with audiences increasingly critical of narratives that prioritized intrigue over empathy. The Sydney case, once a fixture of breaking news, now served as an example of how storytelling itself could mature. The physical artifacts of the investigation, boxes of files, labeled evidence, recorded interviews, remained stored away, silent witnesses to decades of effort and frustration. Occasionally, they were accessed for training or review, handled carefully by people who understood their weight. For the family, the knowledge that these materials existed was both comforting and unsettling, a tangible record of attention and care, but also a reminder of how much time had been spent trying to reconstruct a single night. These artifacts embodied the tension between permanence and impermanence that defined the entire case. Public interest in cold cases continued to fluctuate, driven by new technologies and renewed promises of resolution, and in this environment, the Sydney 1992 case occupied a particular place, cited as proof that persistence could pay off, but also as evidence of the profound delays that can occur. Advocacy groups used it to argue for early intervention and sustained resources, emphasizing that the cost of waiting is measured not only in years, but in lives lived under the shadow of uncertainty. These arguments resonated with policymakers to varying degrees, shaping incremental changes that would take years to fully manifest. For the family, healing remained an ongoing negotiation, influenced by internal shifts rather than external milestones. They learned to recognize when they needed distance from the story and when they could engage with it constructively, trusting their instincts rather than public expectations. Some days, the past felt distant, manageable, integrated into a broader sense of self, while on others, it pressed close, insistent, and heavy. Accepting this variability became part of their resilience, an acknowledgement that recovery does not follow a straight line. In the wider community, the case subtly influenced how disappearances were perceived, fostering a deeper awareness of the long-term impact on families and neighborhoods. People became more attuned to the language used in reporting, more sensitive to the distinction between mystery and trauma. This shift did not eliminate sensationalism, but it introduced a countercurrent, a demand for responsibility that shaped discourse in small but meaningful ways. The Sydney case contributed to this cultural recalibration, its history lending weight to calls for change. As the story aged, it acquired a certain gravity, a sense of having been tempered by time rather than dulled by it. Those who encountered it years later did so without the immediacy of fear or shock, but with a reflective curiosity, an interest in understanding how such a prolonged uncertainty could be endured. In this context, the case functioned as a reminder of human endurance, of the capacity to adapt to even the most destabilizing circumstances. It was no longer just about a crime, but about the ways people live with unresolved absence and, eventually, with difficult truths. The family's future continued to take shape, marked by choices made with intention rather than hesitation. They honored anniversaries without being consumed by them, spoke openly about the past without feeling trapped by it, and allowed joy to coexist with remembrance. In doing so, they demonstrated a form of closure that was not imposed by a verdict, but cultivated through daily practice. The cold case, though officially resolved, remained part of their identity, not as a wound to be reopened, but as a chapter that had been read, understood, and set gently back on the shelf. And as the city moved forward, layering new stories over old ones, the Sydney 1992 case persisted as a quiet reference point, a testament to the long arc of justice and the enduring impact of waiting. It reminded those who remembered it that time alone does not heal, but it can create space for understanding, and that even after decades of silence, truth has the power to reshape lives. In that understanding, the story found its lasting place, not as a headline or a spectacle, but as a shared memory that continued to inform how the city and the people within it understood loss, accountability, and the fragile hope that answers, however delayed, can still arrive. By the time a decade had passed since the verdict, the story had taken on a muted, almost archival quality, no longer pulsing with urgency, but still resonant in the way certain histories refuse to settle completely. For the family, the distance brought a steadier perspective, one shaped less by reaction and more by integration, the slow weaving of the past into a present that could finally breathe. They spoke of the case rarely now, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer demanded constant articulation to be understood. The truth had found its place, no longer an intruder, but a known presence that could be acknowledged without overwhelming everything else. Their lives had expanded in ways that once seemed impossible, careers pursued without the constant interruption of waiting, relationships deepened without the strain of unresolved fear. They traveled, celebrated milestones, planned futures with a confidence that had been absent for most of their adult lives. And yet, beneath these ordinary achievements lay an enduring awareness of fragility, a knowledge hard-earned through loss, that shaped their choices with a quiet caution. Joy was no longer deferred, but it was experienced with a depth that came from understanding how easily it could be taken away. The case's legacy within law enforcement matured as well, evolving from cautionary tale to institutional memory. Training manuals referenced it sparingly but pointedly, emphasizing not its resolution, but the cost of its delay. Supervisors spoke of it when discussing resource allocation, of the importance of sustained attention to cases that might otherwise fade from view. In these professional contexts, the Sydney 1992 cold case became a benchmark, a reminder that investigative patience must be matched with urgency, that waiting should never be mistaken for strategy. Public discourse around cold cases shifted incrementally, influenced by a growing recognition of the human toll exacted by prolonged uncertainty. Advocacy organizations cited the case in submissions and forums, arguing for earlier intervention and long-term support for families of the missing. These efforts did not always produce immediate change, but they contributed to a broader recalibration of priorities, one that acknowledged the emotional labor imposed on those left behind. The Sydney case, though no longer front-page news, continued to inform these conversations, its lessons embedded in policy debates and public awareness campaigns. Cultural representations of the story grew more restrained over time, favoring reflection over dramatization. Documentaries produced years later approached the case with a measured tone, contextualizing it within its era and emphasizing the perspectives of those most affected. Viewers responded to this approach, engaging with the material thoughtfully rather than voyeuristically, and in this reception, there was a sense that the story had finally found a respectful audience. The family, when they chose to watch, did so without the defensive tension that had once accompanied every retelling, able to appreciate nuance without feeling exposed. The physical markers of the past continued to fade, buildings replaced, landscapes altered, yet memory persisted in less visible ways. The family maintained small rituals, private acknowledgments that honored the life at the center of the story without anchoring them to the moment of its end. These acts were not about keeping the wound open, but about ensuring that remembrance remained integrated, a part of life rather than a disruption to it. In this balance, they found a form of peace that had been elusive for decades. The convicted man's status changed little with time, his existence confined to institutional routines that rarely intersected with the family's world. Occasional updates arrived, administrative in nature, and were absorbed with minimal emotional impact. The distance between them, once filled with fear and speculation, had become a neutral space, defined not by denial or obsession, but by indifference. This detachment was not callousness, but a sign of healing, an indication that the past no longer held the power to dominate the present. As new cases emerged and new technologies promised faster answers, the Sydney 1992 case served as a quiet counterpoint, a reminder that progress is uneven and that systems evolve slowly, often in response to failure rather than foresight. It underscored the importance of patience without complacency, of recognizing that innovation cannot retroactively erase the harm caused by delay. These insights informed professional practice and public expectation alike, shaping a more realistic understanding of what justice can and cannot offer. Within the family, storytelling took on a different role, less about explaining loss and more about preserving identity. They shared memories with younger generations, framing them around values and experiences rather than tragedy. The person at the heart of the case was remembered for her humor, her habits, her place within the family, not solely for the way her life ended. This reframing was deliberate, an effort to ensure that her legacy was defined by life rather than absence. The city, constantly renewing itself, carried the case as part of its layered history, one of many narratives that collectively shaped its character. Residents who remembered it spoke of it occasionally, usually in the context of how much had changed, how different things felt now. Those who did not remember it encountered it as history, a story that belonged to another time, yet still resonant in its implications. In this way, the case bridged generations, linking past and present through shared understanding. As the years continued to unfold, the Sydney 1992 cold case settled into a place of quiet significance, no longer demanding attention but deserving respect. It stood as a testament to endurance, to the long wait for truth, and to the complex aftermath of finally receiving it. The family's journey, once defined by uncertainty, had evolved into one marked by resilience, by the capacity to live fully while carrying memory with care. And in that evolution, the story found its most enduring meaning, not in the details of the crime or the drama of its resolution, but in the lives shaped by its long shadow and the strength it took to step out from beneath it. In the end, what remained was not the crime itself, nor even the verdict that had once felt so monumental, but the quiet, persistent imprint left behind, the way a single unresolved night had threaded itself through countless lives and then, slowly, loosened its grip. For the family, this final stage was not marked by ceremony or announcement, but by an almost imperceptible shift, a day when they realized the story no longer rose up uninvited in every silence. It was still there, always would be, but it no longer demanded the center of the room. The truth had settled, not comfortably, but securely enough that it could be carried without constant strain. They found themselves speaking about her with an ease that once would have felt impossible, telling stories without bracing for the inevitable turn toward disappearance and loss. Her name no longer stopped conversations cold, no longer pulled every memory into the same dark orbit. Instead, it moved freely through family gatherings, attached to anecdotes, laughter, shared recognition of a life fully lived before it was interrupted. In these moments, the cold case receded further, becoming context rather than definition, a chapter rather than the whole book. The long arc of the investigation, from frantic early searches to decades of silence and finally to resolution, came to be understood as something larger than a single failure or success. It was a reflection of its time, of limitations both technical and human, of assumptions that once felt reasonable and later proved costly. This understanding did not excuse the years of waiting, but it gave them shape, allowing those affected to place their suffering within a broader framework rather than carrying it as a personal injustice alone. In that reframing, there was a measure of release. For those who had worked the case, now mostly retired or nearing the end of their careers, the story lingered as a quiet companion. Some spoke of it in interviews, their voices softer than they would have been years earlier, less defensive, more reflective. They acknowledged mistakes without self-flagellation, spoke of lessons learned without triumphalism, and emphasized the human dimension that had driven them back to the file when so many others had been closed and forgotten. Solving the case had not erased regret, but it had given it purpose, transforming it into resolve for future work. The city, ever restless, absorbed the case into its layered memory, one more story folded into its identity. Sydney had changed dramatically since 1992, its skyline reshaped, its neighborhoods transformed, its rhythms accelerated, yet the case endured as a reminder of a slower, less surveilled time, when disappearance could stretch endlessly without digital trace. In this contrast, people found perspective, an understanding of both progress and vulnerability, of how far systems had come and how far they still had to go. The language surrounding cold cases evolved as well, shaped by stories like this one, moving away from the romance of mystery toward an emphasis on endurance and impact. Journalists, advocates, and educators spoke more openly about the toll of waiting, about the lives lived in suspension, about the way uncertainty seeps into every decision. The Sydney 1992 case, often cited in these conversations, stood as evidence that resolution, while valuable, is only part of the equation, and that support for families must extend far beyond the moment a case is closed. For the family, that understanding validated what they had felt all along, that their suffering did not end with answers, but transformed, requiring a different kind of care. They continued to build lives shaped by empathy, by attentiveness to others' pain, by a refusal to take ordinary days for granted. Friends noticed it in small ways, the way they listened more closely, the way they showed up without being asked, the way they understood loss even when it went unspoken. These qualities were not gifts they would have chosen, but they were real, and they mattered. As the years moved on, the practical markers of the case faded further, files archived, evidence sealed, media interest reduced to occasional retrospectives. Yet the emotional truth persisted, not as an open wound, but as a scar that told a story of survival. The family no longer measured time by the disappearance or the verdict, but by milestones reclaimed, anniversaries marked with intention rather than dread, futures imagined without hesitation. In this, they achieved something that once seemed unattainable, a life not defined by what had been taken, but informed by it. The convicted man remained absent from their thoughts, his existence acknowledged only when required by administrative notice. His silence, once a source of frustration, had lost its power, replaced by a firm understanding that some answers would never come, and that waiting for them would only reopen a door they had worked hard to close. This acceptance was not resignation, but choice, an active decision to prioritize their own well-being over the pursuit of complete narrative closure. In classrooms, training rooms, and community halls, the case continued to surface, not as a spectacle, but as a point of reflection. It prompted questions about how societies respond to unresolved harm, about the balance between hope and realism, about the ethical responsibilities owed to those left behind. These discussions did not always reference names or dates, but the influence was there, shaping attitudes, informing policy, nudging systems toward greater care and persistence. In this way, the case contributed to change beyond its immediate scope. The family, aware of this broader impact, took quiet comfort in the idea that their long ordeal had not been meaningless. They did not see themselves as symbols or advocates by default, but they recognized that their endurance had added weight to conversations that might otherwise have remained abstract. This knowledge did not erase the pain, but it gave it context, a sense that something constructive had emerged from years of uncertainty. As old age approached for some and new generations came of age for others, the story was passed down with intention, not as a warning steeped in fear, but as a lesson in resilience and compassion. Younger relatives learned not only what had happened, but how those before them had endured it, how they had navigated the long wait, how they had chosen to live fully even when answers were slow to arrive. In this transmission, the story transformed again, becoming part of a lineage defined not solely by tragedy, but by strength. The final truth of the Sydney 1992 cold case was not found in court transcripts or verdict forms, but in this ongoing process of integration, the way lives gradually reoriented around certainty after decades of doubt. The case was closed, officially and irrevocably, yet its influence continued to unfold, shaping perspectives, guiding choices, reminding those who remembered it that justice is not a moment, but a journey with consequences that extend far beyond the law. And so the voice that once called out in the dark, demanding answers, softened into something steadier, more reflective. The night that had begun with disappearance ended, at last, with understanding, incomplete and imperfect, but real. The city carried on, the family moved forward, and the cold case, once a symbol of absence, settled into history as a testament to patience, persistence, and the enduring human capacity to survive even the longest wait for truth. Time, having loosened its grip, began to reveal subtler consequences, the kind that only surface when a story has truly settled into the fabric of lived experience. Part 12 was not about events or revelations, but about resonance, the faint afterimages that linger long after the main shape has faded. For the family, this phase arrived quietly, in the realization that their lives were no longer organized around recovery, but around presence, around what it meant to be fully here after so many years spent partially elsewhere, suspended between hope and fear. The past no longer pulled at them with urgency, yet it remained a companion, informing their sense of what mattered and what did not. They noticed it in their tolerance for silence, how it no longer felt threatening, how empty rooms no longer demanded to be filled with explanation. Silence had once been a space where questions screamed, where every unanswered call or knock carried possibility and dread. Now it was simply silence, neutral, sometimes even comforting, a sign that the long vigil was truly over. In that quiet, they found room to think about the future in unguarded ways, to imagine years ahead without bracing for interruption. The broader world, still fascinated by resolution, continued to mine old stories for meaning, and occasionally the Sydney case resurfaced in discussions about justice delayed, about the promise and limits of perseverance. When it did, it felt distant, like hearing one's own name spoken in another room, recognizable but no longer demanding response. The family learned to let those moments pass, understanding that the story had taken on a life of its own, one that no longer required their constant stewardship. Their role had shifted from participants to witnesses, observing how others interpreted something they had lived. In institutions, the case continued to exert a quiet influence, shaping policy revisions, informing best practices, reminding decision-makers that unresolved cases are not merely administrative burdens, but ongoing human emergencies. These changes were incremental, rarely dramatic, but they accumulated over time, altering the landscape in ways that would be invisible to most, yet profoundly significant to those who might one day need them. The Sydney 1992 cold case became part of this slow evolution, its lessons embedded in procedures and protocols that would never mention its name. The family's relationship with memory deepened, becoming less reactive and more intentional. They curated what they shared and how they shared it, choosing stories that reflected character rather than circumstance. This act of selection was not denial, but authorship, a reclaiming of narrative agency after decades of being defined by a single event. In telling her story this way, they ensured that she remained present as a person, not a symbol, her life remembered for its fullness rather than its abrupt ending. There were moments, still, when grief surged unexpectedly, triggered by milestones missed or futures imagined too late. These moments no longer felt catastrophic, but they were no less real for their rarity. The family met them with patience rather than panic, understanding that grief does not disappear, it transforms, shifting shape as life continues to grow around it. They allowed themselves to feel it fully and then let it recede, confident now that it would not overtake them entirely. The city, indifferent and enduring, continued to change, absorbing new stories, new losses, new triumphs. Yet beneath that constant renewal lay a cumulative wisdom, shaped by cases like this one, by the recognition that disappearance leaves scars not only on families, but on communities. This awareness influenced how people responded to new cases, how quickly concern mobilized, how seriously uncertainty was treated. The Sydney case had become part of that shared understanding, a silent reference point that informed collective behavior without demanding acknowledgement. As years layered themselves gently over the truth, the family's sense of identity stabilized, no longer reactive, no longer provisional. They were not defined by what had happened to them, but by how they had lived through it, by the choices they made when certainty finally arrived. This distinction mattered deeply, marking the difference between survival and authorship, between being shaped by events and shaping one's response to them. In moments of reflection, they recognized that the long wait had taught them things they might never have learned otherwise, about patience, about ambiguity, about the limits of control. These lessons were not romanticized, not framed as blessings, but acknowledged as real, hard-earned insights forged in the absence of answers. They carried these insights forward quietly, applying them to everyday decisions, to relationships, to the way they met uncertainty when it inevitably arose again in other forms. The story, now complete in its essentials, continued to breathe through these lives, not as an open wound, but as a reminder of endurance. It no longer demanded retelling, no longer sought validation through repetition. Instead, it existed as a foundation, an underlying context that supported growth rather than restricting it. The cold case, once an active presence, had become history, not erased, but integrated, its sharp edges softened by time and understanding. And in this final phase, there was a subtle but profound shift, the realization that the search for meaning had ended not with an answer, but with acceptance. The family no longer asked why this had happened, or what might have been different, but focused instead on how they would continue, how they would honor the past without living inside it. This acceptance was not passive, but deliberate, a daily choice reinforced through action rather than reflection. The Sydney 1992 cold case, having traveled from shock to silence, from mystery to truth, now rested in this space of quiet consequence. Its journey had altered lives, institutions, and perspectives, leaving behind a legacy measured not in headlines or verdicts, but in the ways people learned to wait, to persist, and ultimately, to live with what they found. In that enduring aftermath, the story found its final form, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a testament to the human capacity to move forward even when the past remains indelibly present. What emerged after all the words had been spoken, after the files were closed and the lessons absorbed, was something quieter still, a kind of emotional afterweather that settled over everything the case had touched. Part 13 lived in that space, beyond resolution, beyond reflection, where meaning was no longer actively sought, but gradually revealed through living. For the family, this stage felt less like healing and more like inhabiting a new normal, one built not on forgetting, but on an unforced acceptance that the story would always be part of them without needing to be revisited. They noticed how rarely they spoke about the case now, not because it had lost significance, but because it no longer needed reinforcement to stay real. It existed without effort, woven into their understanding of themselves and each other. Conversations flowed without detouring into explanation. Shared glances carried context without words, and in this mutual understanding there was a sense of stability that had been absent for much of their lives. The past no longer demanded narration to be acknowledged. In moments of solitude, each of them encountered the memory differently. Some felt it as a quiet presence, others as a distant ache, but none experienced the sharp urgency that had once defined their days. The fear of forgetting, once so powerful, had dissolved, replaced by confidence that remembrance did not depend on vigilance. Memory, they learned, could be trusted to endure on its own. Beyond the family, the case's influence continued in diffuse, almost invisible ways. It shaped how professionals approached uncertainty, how communities responded to absence, how institutions spoke about time and responsibility. These changes were not dramatic enough to be traced to a single source, yet they carried the imprint of accumulated stories like this one, reminders that unresolved harm does not simply fade with age. The Sydney case contributed to that collective awareness. Its impact spread thin but wide, like pressure applied slowly over years. The cultural appetite for true crime continued to evolve, and with it, a growing discomfort with narratives that treated suffering as entertainment. The case was sometimes mentioned in critiques of the genre, cited as an example of why restraint and empathy mattered. These conversations did not undo past excesses, but they marked a shift, a recognition that behind every mystery lay people who had lived with its consequences long after the audience moved on. In that shift, the story found a measure of dignity it had not always been afforded. For the family, dignity became a guiding principle, influencing how they spoke, what they shared, what they declined. They no longer felt compelled to correct misconceptions or engage with speculation, understanding that the public version of the story would always diverge from their lived reality. Letting go of that need was liberating, a final step away from the role of participants in a narrative that had once consumed them. They reclaimed ownership not by controlling the story, but by refusing to be governed by it. As years continued to pass, the emotional landscape flattened in a way that felt unfamiliar but welcome. High peaks of pain and hope gave way to a steadier terrain, where grief existed without dominating and joy arrived without guilt. This balance was not static, it required attention and care, but it was sustainable in a way the earlier extremes had not been. Life no longer felt provisional. The city, indifferent yet shaped by all it carried, moved on as it always did, absorbing new residents, new histories, new losses. The Sydney of 1992 existed now mostly in memory and archive, yet the case served as a bridge between that past and the present, a reminder of how much had changed and how much had not. In its quiet endurance, the story underscored a simple truth, that cities remember not through monuments alone, but through the accumulation of human experience. Occasionally, someone new would learn of the case and react with the shock once felt by the entire community. Those reactions now felt distant, almost foreign, reminders of a time when the outcome was unknown and fear filled the gaps. The family met these responses with patience, understanding that every story has its own timeline, that others were encountering in moments what they had lived with for decades. There was compassion in that understanding, but no desire to relive it. In private moments of reflection, they acknowledged that the truth, when it finally arrived, had not answered every question, nor erased every doubt. But it had given them something essential, a fixed point around which life could reorganize. Uncertainty had once been the dominant force, shaping every decision, every hope. Now, certainty, however painful, had freed them to move forward without reservation. The cold case, once a source of relentless motion, had come to rest, not forgotten, not minimized, but placed where it belonged, in the past, informing the present without overwhelming it. Its power now lay not in its mystery or its resolution, but in what it revealed about endurance, about the long human capacity to wait, to adapt, and to continue. And so the story reached this further edge, beyond closure, beyond aftermath, into a space where it no longer needed to be told to be true. It lived on in choices made quietly, in relationships strengthened by shared survival, in a collective understanding that some nights echo far longer than others. The Sydney 1992 cold case had taken its place among those echoes, no longer calling out for attention, but remaining, steady and undeniable, as part of the deep, lived history of those who had carried it all this way. What followed, beyond even this long settling, was a subtle reckoning with legacy, not the kind etched into records or remembered by institutions, but the kind that takes shape in private decisions, in how people choose to move through the world once a defining burden has finally been set down. Part 14 existed in this quiet reckoning, where the absence of urgency created space for intention. The family began to notice how often their instincts were guided by what they had lived through, how patience had become reflexive, how empathy surfaced before judgment, how they approached uncertainty with a steadiness forged in years when answers were scarce. They saw it in the way they responded to others' grief, recognizing the signs of suspended time, the way loss can freeze the future until something breaks the spell. They did not offer platitudes or premature comfort, knowing too well how hollow such words can sound. Instead, they offered presence, an understanding that did not require explanation. This capacity to sit with discomfort, once a survival skill, had become a form of quiet strength, something they carried into friendships, workplaces, and communities without ever naming its origin. The memory of the case no longer arrived as a narrative, but as a feeling, a faint pressure behind certain choices, a reminder of how quickly life can fracture and how long it can take to reassemble. It influenced where they invested their energy, how they weighed risk, how they valued time together. None of this felt heavy or burdensome anymore. It was simply part of their internal compass, calibrated by experience rather than fear. The long wait had taught them to discern what was essential and what was noise. In the broader world, attention continued to drift, as it always does, toward newer stories, fresher crises, more immediate questions. The Sydney 1992 cold case slipped further into historical context, referenced occasionally, but no longer central to contemporary discourse. This fading did not feel like erasure to the family, but like a natural progression, a sign that the story had completed its public work. Its most important effects were no longer visible, residing instead in changed practices, altered attitudes, and lives quietly redirected. Institutions that had once struggled under the weight of unresolved cases carried forward lessons learned, even as personnel changed and priorities shifted. The case's influence persisted not as a cautionary tale repeated aloud, but as an underlying assumption, a shared understanding that delay has consequences, that persistence matters, that families are not collateral but central. These principles, absorbed over time, shaped decisions in ways that would never be traced back to a single file, yet owed something to it all the same. For the family, the passage of time brought a new relationship with anniversaries. Dates that had once loomed like deadlines or